Have you ever had a really, really bad day? I mean the kind where you stub your toe, spill coffee on your white shirt, and your boss gives you that look that makes you want to crawl under your desk? Well, buckle up, friends, because we're about to take a journey that'll make your worst day feel like a trip to Disneyland. Welcome to the most spine-chilling, stomach-turning, yet fascinating exploration of humanity's darkest creativity, the cruelest methods of punishment in history. Now, before you click away thinking this is just another gore-fest documentary, let me tell you something. This isn't just about the pain. This is about the incredible, albeit terrifying, ingenuity of human minds throughout history. You see, our ancestors weren't just cruel. They were innovative in their cruelty. And understanding these methods tells us more about human psychology, social control, and power dynamics than any textbook ever could. Part 1. The Dawn of Pain: Ancient Civilizations and Their Creative Cruelty. Let's start with ancient Persia, where they developed something called scaphism. Sounds fancy, right? Like a spa treatment, maybe? Oh, how wrong you'd be. Picture this. It's a warm Persian day, and you've just been accused of a crime. The punishment? Being strapped between two boats, force-fed milk and honey until you can't take another bite. And then, let's just say the insects get a feast of their own. But here's the truly fascinating part. The Persians didn't just create this punishment for the physical torture. They designed it as a psychological weapon, a deterrent so horrifying that merely hearing about it would keep potential criminals in line. Speaking of psychological warfare, let's hop over to ancient China, where they perfected something called lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts. But hold on to your lunch, because this isn't your average paper cut situation. The genius, and I use that term with both admiration and horror, of lingqi was its precision. Trained executioners would make calculated cuts, carefully avoiding vital organs, ensuring the victim remained conscious for as long as possible. But here's where it gets really interesting. The number of cuts wasn't actually 1,000. It varied depending on the severity of the crime. Think of it as a macabre accounting system, where your crimes literally determined how many pieces of you would be removed. The ancient Romans, not to be outdone, created what might be the most recognized symbol of execution in history: crucifixion. But what most people don't know is that crucifixion wasn't just about nailing someone to a cross. It was an elaborate public relations campaign, a theater of pain designed to send a very specific message: don't mess with Rome. The condemned would be paraded through the streets, forced to carry their own cross, and then positioned at high-traffic locations. It wasn't just execution, it was advertising. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of these ancient punishments isn't their creativity in causing pain. It's how they reflected the values and fears of their societies. Take the Greek punishment of ostracism, for example. In a society that valued community above all else, being voted into exile by your fellow citizens wasn't just a punishment, it was a social death sentence. And that brings us to an important question. What does it say about a society that puts so much thought into causing pain? The answer might surprise you, and we'll explore that in our next segment, where we'll dive into the Middle Ages, a time when punishment became an art form, and torturers were considered skilled craftsmen. But before we move on, consider this. Every single method we've discussed was designed not just to punish, but to send a message. These weren't just executions, they were carefully choreographed performances of power. And as we'll see in our next segment, this theatrical approach to punishment would only become more elaborate as human civilization advanced. So, if you think you can handle it, stick around. Because believe it or not, what we've covered so far is just the appetizer in this feast of historical horrors. And trust me, you won't want to miss what comes next, especially when we get to the part about medieval Europe's most popular form of entertainment, which, spoiler alert, wasn't exactly a Renaissance fair. Part 2, the medieval masterpiece, when torture became an art form. Remember how I mentioned medieval Europe's favorite form of entertainment? Well, grab your popcorn, or maybe don't, because we're about to dive into a period where public execution wasn't just a punishment, it was the hottest ticket in town. Picture this. It's a crisp morning in 14th century London. The streets are buzzing with excitement. Market sellers are doing their best business, not in vegetables or cloth, but in prime viewing spots around the town square. Why? Because today, someone's going to be put in the breaking wheel. And in medieval Europe, that was better than Netflix theater and the Super Bowl combined. The breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine wheel, was a diabolically simple yet effective device. But here's the thing that'll really bake your noodle. It wasn't designed just to kill. It was engineered to create the perfect public spectacle. The condemned would have their limbs systematically broken, then woven through the spokes of a large wheel. But here's the clever part. Skilled executioners knew exactly how to break bones without causing immediate death. The victim would be hoisted up on a pole, still alive, sometimes for days. Think about that next time you complain about your uncomfortable office chair. But medieval Europe wasn't just about the wheel. They had what you might call a full menu of options. Take the brazen bull, for instance, a hollow brass statue of a bull with a door on the side. Now, you might be thinking, that doesn't sound so bad, but wait for it. The bull was designed with acoustic tubes that converted the victim's screams into what sounded like the bellowing of an angry bull. Its inventor, Perillos of Athens, was so proud of his creation that he personally demonstrated the acoustic features to the tyrant Phalaris. Spoiler alert, Phalaris decided to make Perillos the bull's first victim. Talk about a product demonstration gone wrong. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect of medieval punishment wasn't the devices themselves. It was the people who operated them. Torture wasn't just a job. It was a respected profession. Professional torturers were like the medieval equivalent of skilled surgeons. They had to understand anatomy, psychology, and the delicate art of prolonging life while inflicting maximum pain. They even had their own guilds and apprenticeship programs. Think about that for a second. The same person who might be breaking your legs on Tuesday could be setting your broken arm on Wednesday. The medieval period also gave us the rack, a device so infamous it became a verb. Being racked meant being stretched until your joints dislocated and your muscles tore. But here's something they don't tell you in the history books. The rack wasn't just about physical pain. It was designed to be adjustable, allowing the torturer to increase or decrease the tension based on the victim's willingness to confess. It was, in essence, the world's most horrible negotiation tool. And speaking of negotiations, let's talk about the pear of anguish. Despite its fruity name, this wasn't something you'd want to find in your lunchbox. This expanding metal device was used as both a torture instrument and a way to extract confessions. The truly dark genius of it was that it could be used without leaving any external marks, perfect for those who wanted their victims to still look presentable for public execution later. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of medieval punishment wasn't the physical pain. It was the theatrical element. These weren't just executions, they were carefully choreographed performances. Executions were scheduled for market days to ensure maximum attendance. Vendors sold snacks. Children were given front row seats because it was considered educational. Part 3. The Enlightenment, when science met suffering. Think you're having a productive day at work? Well, let me tell you about some folks from the Age of Enlightenment who took workplace efficiency to a whole new level of horrifying. Meet Dr. Joseph Ignace Guillotin, a French physician who looked at execution and thought, you know what this needs? Some scientific precision. Now, contrary to popular belief, Dr. Guillotin didn't invent the guillotine. He just gave it his seal of medical approval. He was actually trying to make execution more humane. Talk about workplace improvements gone wrong. The guillotine was marketed as the iPhone of execution devices, sleek, efficient, and supposedly painless. But here's the truly unsettling part. Scientists of the time were genuinely fascinated by how long consciousness might persist after decapitation. They would pick up freshly severed heads and shout questions at them, carefully noting any eye movements or facial expressions. One scientist even claimed a head responded to its name for up to 30 seconds after separation. But the guillotine wasn't the only innovation of the Enlightenment period. This was the era when someone looked at water torture and thought, how can we make this more efficient? Enter the water cure, a sophisticated version of waterboarding that involved forcing massive amounts of water into a person's body. The enlightened twist? They'd sometimes add vinegar or other substances to the water, for science. The truly fascinating part is how they justified these methods. Everything had to be documented, measured, and recorded. They weren't just torturing people, they were conducting experiments. Imagine the grant proposals, seeking funding for research into the effects of systematic organ failure. Actually, don't imagine that. Let's move on. The Enlightenment also gave us the scientific study of stress positions. Someone actually sat down and calculated exactly how long a human body could support its weight in various uncomfortable positions before permanent damage occurred. They called it research. We call it nightmare fuel. But perhaps the most disturbing innovation of this period wasn't physical at all. It was psychological. The Enlightenment brought us solitary confinement, originally conceived as a more humane alternative to physical torture. The thinking was beautiful in its terrible simplicity. Instead of breaking the body, why not just break the mind? Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia became the model for this new approach. Prisoners were kept in complete isolation with only a small skylight, nicknamed the Eye of God, for company. The architects even designed the corridors with special padding so guards could observe prisoners without being heard. And speaking of anxiety, let's talk about the psychological experiments conducted in the name of punishment. Scientists began studying the effects of sensory deprivation, sleep deprivation, and various forms of psychological manipulation. They meticulously documented how long it took to break someone's will without ever laying a finger on them. But here's the real kicker. Many of these enlightened methods are still in use today, just with different names and justifications. That brings us to our next segment, where we'll explore how these scientific approaches to punishment evolved into modern-day practices that would make even our medieval ancestors raise an eyebrow. Because as it turns out, sometimes the most effective form of cruelty isn't a dramatic public spectacle or a sophisticated machine. It's the slow, methodical application of psychology and bureaucracy. Part 4, Modern Times, the Evolution of Punishment. Think everything we've discussed is safely tucked away in history books? Well, pour yourself a strong cup of coffee, because we're about to explore how historical methods of punishment have evolved into something perhaps even more chilling, modern, systematic control. Let's start with something that might hit close to home. Have you ever been stuck in a tiny cubicle under fluorescent lights, feeling your soul slowly crumble? Well, that office layout you're complaining about has more in common with historical punishment than you might think. The modern open office actually draws inspiration from Jeremy Bentham's Panopticon, a prison design where inmates could be observed at all times without knowing when they were being watched. Sound familiar? Corporate warriors? But let's dig deeper into modern penal systems. Remember our friends from the Enlightenment who were so interested in psychological torture? Their legacy lives on in supermax prisons, where inmates spend 23 hours a day in complete isolation. The United Nations has actually classified prolonged solitary confinement as a form of torture. Yet here we are, still using it, just with better lighting and occasional cable TV. Speaking of psychological manipulation, let's talk about something truly fascinating: white torture. Developed in the 20th century, it involves placing prisoners in completely white rooms, feeding them only white rice on white plates, and dressing them in white clothes. The goal? Complete sensory deprivation. No physical pain necessary, just the slow erosion of the human psyche. Makes medieval torture devices look almost quaint, doesn't it? But perhaps the most insidious modern development isn't in prisons at all. It's in the way we've systematized punishment through bureaucracy. Think about it. Instead of a public execution, we now have death by paperwork. Take civil forfeiture, for example. No need for thumb screws when you can legally seize someone's property without even charging them with a crime. The medieval torturer has been replaced by the bureaucrat with a keyboard. And let's not forget about social credit systems. Some countries have developed sophisticated methods of controlling behavior through points and privileges. Imagine losing your right to travel because you jaywalked too many times. The rack? Please. Modern society can stretch you financially until you break, all while maintaining a perfectly legal smile. But here's where it gets really interesting. We've also developed what you might call invisible punishments. Criminal records that follow people for life, preventing them from getting jobs, housing, or education. It's like a modern version of medieval branding, except instead of a hot iron, we use databases and background checks. And speaking of databases, let's talk about surveillance. We've created systems of monitoring so sophisticated that they would make medieval spy networks look like amateur hour. Your phone tracks your location, your social media posts are analyzed, and your buying habits are scrutinized. The stocks and pillory have been replaced by algorithms and data points. But perhaps the most profound evolution isn't in the methods themselves, it's in how we justify them. Medieval torturers claimed they were saving souls. Enlightenment torturers claimed they were advancing science. Today, we claim we're maintaining order, ensuring security, or protecting society. The justifications change, but the underlying psychology remains disturbingly similar. So what's the takeaway from this dark journey through human history? Perhaps it's this: while we may have traded in the rack and the breaking wheel for more subtle methods, human creativity in causing suffering hasn't diminished, it's just gotten more sophisticated. The real question isn't whether we've become more humane in our punishments, but whether we've become better at hiding their true nature from others and from ourselves. And maybe that's the most chilling revelation of all. Because when you can't see the instruments of punishment, when they're buried in bureaucracy and justified by algorithms, how do you fight against them? But that's a question for another video. For now, remember this: the next time someone tells you we've moved beyond cruel and unusual punishment, show them your smartphone's privacy settings. Because sometimes the cruelest prison isn't made of iron bars and stone walls. It's made of ones and zeros, paperwork, and social expectations. And that, dear viewers, is perhaps the most diabolical punishment method of all. The one we willingly accept without even realizing it's there. Sleep tight.